Just kind of offering my personal appreciation to each of you for the work that you do and for your service to our community. What you do is sacred, holy work, and I just want to offer my appreciation to each of you and to your organizations and agencies. I do want to kind of talk about understanding grief and grieving with this, and I kind of come at this myself a little bit in two ways. One, just my own background, having been a law enforcement officer up in Hendersonville for a few years, as a chaplain, as a psychotherapist, and even as an uncle who went through the journey with my older brother and his wife at the drowning of their 3-year-old daughter, Kendall, my niece. And so I kind of come at this experience from some different angles and some different dimensions of that, trying to kind of bring that all together to kind of understand that experience. And so my title for me is very purposeful when I put that phrase at the end of the world. Do you remember when they used to draw old maps and they weren't sure what was beyond a certain point because nobody explored it? It was kind of the end of the world, so they just wrote on the map, beyond this point there be dragons, right? Well, that's where you all journey. When y'all come into an investigative situation where you're working with a loss and tragedy of this nature, you're kind of going where nobody has maps. And you're kind of going into those territories of people's lives that very few ever adventure into. And so there's something, I think, significant about that. And I want us to spend some time looking at that. Of course, there's in your training, there's the mandate there that you'll have some sensitivity to family grief, and all of you have that. The key here in us to maybe talk about, what I hope to maybe offer today, is to think about how do you integrate that sensitivity with the investigative processes and techniques and methodologies that you have to do. How do you blend those two things together? So in some ways that sensitivity becomes one of your tools to aid in your investigative processes that you're undertaking, while at the same time offering that service to that individual that you're there to do as well. And so I know that you, throughout probably your training and throughout many of these events, you've had an opportunity to look through grief and the stages of grief and things of that nature. So my hope is maybe I can add to that some concrete do's and don'ts. And I want y'all to feel free to kind of, in your role, I doubt if many of y'all are shrinking violets. So I don't think y'all shy individuals. So if you got a question or thought, scenario, situation, offer that up. We can kind of learn with that together, because I want to make this useful to you and worthwhile. And then, of course, I'm going to kind of touch upon that taboo of any of us in any line of serving others. And that's what you do. I doubt if you kind of came into your work just thinking, I'm going to look for the best paying job I can find with a good work-life balance. When you go into serving others, that's a lot. And my sense is that you at some level feel called to do what you do. And so in the role of serving others, the very thing that gives us a heart to serve other people and to put ourselves in harm's way for the sake of others and things of that nature is the very thing that can do us in. So I am going to touch upon that taboo, that 4-letter word called care. Okay? So I'm going to get to meddling at that point. All right? It's like I tell nurses when I orient them in the hospital care. Nurses are real proud because they say, I hadn't peed in 3 days. When I eat, my meal in 30 seconds. Well, we're going to kind of talk about that important thing of self-care. And Dr. Edwards, you had mentioned that, kind of teeing that up. And we're going to look at that a little more. And I'm going to give you some science behind that too, with that as well. So if you don't mind, let's kind of go ahead and get going. I'm going to drink a little water to build a little steam. I know I got a divinity background, but don't worry, I ain't going to put you in a committee and I won't take up an offering. Is that a deal? That's pretty good. All right, well, let's look at it. I want to kind of own up front my mental model about this issue of grief and grieving based on coming into these kind of tragedies and situations of infant loss and sudden infant death, things of that nature. And that is what I want to suggest to us all. And then we're going to use that to understand why we're going to maybe use certain tools and techniques and maybe not others. Okay? And that is that it's not only just an issue of a loss or an experience of a loss or a phenomena of a loss, but it is a traumatic loss. I want to underline and emphasize the word trauma there. And so when you come as first responders, when you come very early into that experience of this situation in your investigation, what I want you to keep in mind is that you're not entering so much at this point in terms of grief and grieving as you are into post-traumatic stress. That has significant implications for grief. And so when you think about trauma and you look at the literature around that, you talk about a sense of fragmentation. That is, that sense of glue that holds me together seems to be giving way a little bit. I can just feel myself kind of, quote, coming apart at the seams, right? That has psychological implications and emotional implications, physiological implications, spiritual implications, relational implications. There's this sense of fragmentation that then can lead into this sense of disorientation. That's why when folks go through traumatic situations, it can be those things that orient and ground people to reality begin to loosen a little bit. That's why time can slow down, almost as if things are going in slow motion, as if I'm watching things from outside of myself. You know, those kind of phenomena that begin to happen. And of course, that leads into certainly intense feelings that can just spring on someone at a moment's notice, that can be triggered by things that akin themselves to the memory of that event. All of those things. My niece, Courtney, was 10 years old when her little sister drowned, and she was the one that first found her. And whenever she could get the whiff of honeysuckles, guess what? Those feelings could come back, because that was a key trigger memory for her, because where she entered into that neighbor's pool was bushes of honeysuckles, you see. And that somehow in her mind, in that process of intense feelings, those two things got connected up for her. You see what I'm saying? Just to understand some of that. And then, of course, over time, there can always sometimes be that residue, and hopefully as that trauma metabolizes into grief, and grief metabolizes into healing, there's still sometimes that little residue. That's a little different from the grief process. So what I'm saying is that you enter into folks on that big, intense end of trauma, and you may journey with them based on your role in the team or based on your role in that investigation. You may journey with that family for a while, and you can see them move from those phases of trauma where little by little it switches and the phases of grief begin to become more prominent. They're always there together. So I don't mean to kind of separate this as if it's clean cut. I just, again, want to underline the aspect that when you really first encounter these family systems and these individuals early on, realize when you're dealing with someone in trauma, and later on as we look, that's going to really, really need to kind of flag some things for you when you think about how do you communicate? How do you understand certain behavioral responses or the absence thereof? Okay? So we'll look at that. Also has important implications for that four-letter word, self-care. Okay? So we'll look at that a little bit. So let's kind of go into some of these tools a little bit. And I want to, again, give you a little bit of the science so that you understand these families, and you also kind of understand a little bit of yourself here. And so let's just for a minute talk about the stress response. If you ever had a car pull out in front of you, or if you're like me, I got a 14-year-old son who's in this phase where he loves to kind of jump out and scare me and his mother. You know, you've introduced yourself to the stress response. That's that survival mechanism in the hypothalamus of the brain that within nanoseconds your body is primed and prepared to fight, to flee, or to freeze. It's made for our survival. So within nanoseconds, my body is flooded with a chemical soup that prepares me for my survival, either to engage in confrontation, to flee in survival, or to freeze maybe so that I'm not detected. So I get flooded with things like corticosteroids that increase my agility, my strength. It switches my emotions. It moves my brain into alpha waves, which are very much scanning the environment. It's like I'm ADHD on steroids because I'm constantly looking for anything that could, to me, be a sign of danger. I lose my peripheral vision. I become more myopic because I'm focused in right on that doorway, wired on that bush that's making that noise. My body's flooded with, those corticosteroids increase my heart rate. They make my respiratory rate shallow so that I'm an upper chest breather more. And they push about 300 to 500% more volume of blood out into the extremities. It turns off my immune system because if I'm eating, I don't have to worry about infection, right? I'm also filled with these catecholamines, these chemicals that are very important for clotting factor and accelerating clotting factor. Another thing that's interesting in the stress response, particularly when you hook people up to PET scan images, these are these images designed to show these hot spots in the brain of where the brain is asking for a lot more energy. When I am in my stress response and you put my brain on a PET scan image, what you begin to notice in my brain is this little lima bean size area called the amygdala. It's the warehouse for all negative emotion. And when I get into the stress response, that amygdala turns red hot on the PET scan. In other words, it's asking for all the energy. And when that goes from orange to red on the PET scan, what's really interesting is right behind my finger, this whole area begins to turn blue. It begins in the left prefrontal lobe, moves over into the right prefrontal lobe, and then before you know it, the whole area on my forehead goes blue. And why is that important? What does that tell us? Well, right behind my finger is everything I use for reality testing. It's where I use critical decision making. It's where I use reasoning and logic. It's where I use problem solving. It's where my higher level functioning for communications and information processing reside. It's even where hope is, in the left prefrontal lobe. So, have you ever tried to reason with somebody who's completely drunk or on drugs? Have you ever got to the point you said, I'm about to lose my mind. I'm about to blow my stack. Well, guess what? We can demonstrate that, see, when you're in the stress response. Which means that when you encounter these individuals in this traumatic grief, you could almost picture them with all of this blue. And we'll talk about the implications for that when it comes to investigative inquiry, in questioning, in listening, in communication. So literally what we're saying is that when I'm in my stress response, I have about the same neurological functioning as a lizard. So when you're stressed out, have you ever said lizard things like, I could just bite their head off? They just make my skin crawl. Well, you're in lizard mode at that moment, right? So it's something really, really important because it takes about 3 to 4 minutes to turn the stress response off. But it only takes nanoseconds to bring it back up. And so again, we're going to keep this in mind as we move through this situation. And it's also something we want to keep in mind when you think about the importance of self-care. I don't know about you, but my stress is on the installment plan, right? I get a little bit today, a little bit tomorrow, and it takes 3 to 4 days for these stress chemicals to dissipate out of the body. Now, I don't know about you. Again, I got a 14-year-old at home. I don't have 3 or 4 days without stress, right? So our pumps are already primed anyway. If people came in here and took a blood draw from us, they would automatically find that we already have certain high levels of these chemicals in our body. In fact, most folks think in American culture today, our stress response has been duct taped in the own position. I mean, just think about your work that you do every day, particularly in your role and in your vocation. You constantly move from one stress scenario to another stress scenario to another stress scenario. So just keep some of the science there in mind as we kind of move through this together. So where we're going to go now is we're going to look at some of this sensitivity training and some tools in kind of three areas. We're going to talk about your presence, your professional presence. We're going to talk about your communication. And then again, we're going to look at the implications of self-care as it relates to that. Because that self-care, those first two skill sets of presence and communication depend greatly upon where you at in terms of your own level of composure, healing, and wholeness. And so we're going to kind of look at that as we move into these areas. And what I would say is, like any of your investigative skill sets, and that's how I want you to frame this, I want you to think of these as just other investigative tools in addition to the other investigative tools that you use. And so the goal here, like when you're doing your investigative tools, you don't keep them in a silo. You integrate them all together, though, that in some way all of these things are occurring at the same time. I want you to think of these particular tools doing the same thing. My presence, my communication, and my self-care, all three of these things can be occurring at the same time. As I am in the midst of investigating the scene, interviewing individuals, looking for data, all of those things as you're moving through that. Okay? So be kind of thinking of those things as we do that. So, y'all hanging in there okay? We need to get up and do a little line dancing. I bet I could pull in some Sugarland music. Y'all all right? Y'all are a quiet bunch. Well, let's hang in there together as we look through this. And I'm assuming everybody's got your loved one cards or flowers or candy today, right? Right? Got Valentine's Day today. So let's talk about professional and personal presence. I've kind of got these broken down to think of it, and then we'll move right into some to-dos or some concrete kind of things maybe that you can do. Some things that you've probably have heard before in other training. Maybe it's been termed something a little differently. Maybe you've learned that before and you just kind of, oh, this is a nice refresher of this. But again, I just give us something to think about. So we're going to look at three things: composure, empathy, and report. And these really kind of begin to build upon each other in a way. When we talk about a composure, what I'm wanting to suggest to you is that you're going to be using your professional presence, your professional identity, your professional role in order to help restore a sense of safety and a sense of security and control to the scene, to the situation, and to those that are there. When someone has had a tragic loss of this nature, their world has come to an end. Internally, they begin to feel that they are falling apart. Externally, life is beginning to fall apart. Everything they kind of thought was how life was is beginning to fall apart. All the maps they used to help navigate through life no longer work. All these things that are occurring there, and in order for, in some ways, in order for your investigative processes to be helped, you have to come in and kind of begin to kind of create this kind of womb, this kind of holding containment of all this stuff. And in the midst of that, begin to kind of draw down little by little the intensity, the stress, and tragedy of it, just to have just enough sense of safety restored. Because your very identity, your very role, your very uniform begins to convey a sense of safety, control, and stability. And you want to be able to do that not in your own emotional presence. So what I often tell to folks, like I talk to code teams and physicians and nurses and others, is that you have to be the least anxious person in the room. Because anxiety is contagious. Let me draw some science for you. The amygdala, remember when we talked about the amygdala? It is referred to as an open biological system. It's different than blood pressure. So for instance, let's say I'm standing up here and my blood pressure begins to increase. It begins to go up. Now, Dr. Edwards' blood pressure, her blood pressure may go up or it may not go up. It really isn't influenced by my blood pressure at all because our blood pressures are closed biological systems. What influences her blood pressure and what influences my blood pressure is contained within our own biological systems. However, the amygdala is an open biological system. My amygdala could begin to increase in its intensity, and guess what will happen with Dr. Edwards' amygdala? It will begin to respond. In fact, studies show that amygdalas can be influenced by one another up to 100 yards. So do you ever wonder why a crowd can become a mob? Ever wonder why they bring counselors into a school when there's been a suicide? You ever wondered why there can be a wave that occurs at a Titans football game when they score? Granted, they didn't do a lot of that this year, right? Amygdala is very powerful. So when you walk into that investigative scene, you have to work on composure so that you don't add to that, see? Because you could walk into a place, and it just don't feel right, you know? Something's going on here. That amygdala, remember, it's a survival. It's that sixth sense of survival radar. That's why amygdalas are very important. So you want to maintain your own sense of calmness, sense of safety, sense of control, because you're trying to help everyone else kind of de-escalate. And many of you have had de-escalation training. So it's similar in that kind of standpoint. And again, what you want to do is you're kind of the eye of the storm. Again, you want to be able to kind of have a compassionate objectivity. You're there to have to do some things. You're there for your investigative process. You're there for other services that you are bringing. So you want that sense of compassion to help restore that sense of safety and maintain that sense of objectivity that you have to have so that you can continue to do the work that you have to do. Secondly, you want to build on a sense of empathy. That is, you got to connect at some level with those that you're going to be interviewing, those that you're going to be interacting with family members, with parents. You want to have a sense of just respect for the vulnerability and for the crisis that they're in. And we'll talk later about kind of caution against certain wording and responses and nonverbal language that could come across with a sense of judgment, because I guarantee you their court is already in session. That mom, that dad, those family members, they're already in hell. And they're already condemned, right? And so in order to keep that process of communication and their processes of information flowing for you so that you can continue both your care and your investigation or other services and processes you got to do, you got to come across in that sense of non-judgment. Maintaining that sense of empathy, that sense of connection, so that you can keep them present to you and you present to them, which in many ways, what I want to suggest to you is that you can approach your investigative process in terms of how you use your person and your own presence as a tool, that you can actually help begin to facilitate a healing process for them, believe it or not. Doesn't mean it's all going to take place there, but in the way that you can get them to begin opening up, sharing their story, sharing their experience, and processing that some, you can actually be a very important element of setting a stage for others to build upon for their healing. Just something to kind of tee up there. So with that empathy, of course, then hopefully when you've been able to maintain that composure and maintain those things, then you're at a place of building that rapport, which is just, rapport really comes from that word from meaning alliance, which is an old Latin term meaning to stand with another in the face of challenge. And so that's what you'll be. You'll be this symbol of safety, this symbol of control, this symbol of refuge for them, in which it's safe for them to begin talking about what they've been through and helping you gather the data and the information that you need going forward to be of help with them. And so it is about kind of developing that. So let's look then at what we've talked about. It is about your professional presence. That's one of the biggest tools that you have in this process. And you want to be able to use that to open people up, to help people have a sense of safety and connection with you so that that trust and that confidence in you and in your role and what you're there to do will help facilitate that process some. Okay? So with that, maybe some simple do's and don'ts, things that maybe, and here's what I would say is many of you probably have been doing this work for many years. And so there's just things you've learned in the field. There's things you've learned through training. Some of you may do training yourself for your team. So if there's ideas that you have or best practices that you've discovered, share them in here, because I guarantee you the collective experience and wisdom of this room is greater than any individual that can come up here and talk to you. I'm just one pilgrim to another. Okay, just telling you where I found some watering holes. Okay, so I trust that there's a lot more wisdom in this room than I could ever research on my own. So if there's some ideas, things that you've learned, things that you have found that work real well, I really encourage you to kind of share them with each other, because that can be really, really powerful. So let me just give you some tips then. Using your own sense of presence. This first one goes both ways. First of all, you need to be aware of your own personal experience of traumatic loss and grief. Be aware of what that is in your own background, and never underestimate its power to come up and tap you on the shoulder. You know, sometimes these experiences, like uninvited house guests, they have a key to your house, they show up with luggage, they never tell you when they're coming, they don't tell you when they're leaving. They're just that kind of in-law or outlaw that just shows up. And when you get around this work, that's going to be there for you. And in your role, it can be in two ways. One of which, if you've had your own traumatic loss in your life. But secondly, sometimes just the residue of trauma that you're exposed to. I tell folks like this in healthcare all the time. Many of you interface with healthcare environment plus your own environment, which means you kind of get a double dosage. I tell nurses all the time, said, look, there's one thing you're faced with 24/7, human suffering. And you'll see things done to the human body that no one else will. That has a certain residue that you have to you have to respect, and you have to be mindful of it. So be aware of this and never underestimate. Also is, I'd ask you that as you're engaging things, you want to also be aware of this in that person's life as well. Have they had other traumatic loss? Have they had other grief that they're going through? You need to be aware of that as you engage them, because that may give you important clues and information and data and insight in terms of how you interact with them. Okay? So you may want to just ask that. You know, have you had any other losses recently? Any other tragedies that you've been going through? You know, that becomes really important. I'll give you something just real simple. My father passed away in this August. And so here I was, I kind of got this little tool, so I'm kind of transferring family videos to the computer so I can kind of save them. And I come across the first ones I put in is my mom and dad's 50th wedding anniversary in 2005. I was just bawling like a baby, because that was kind of the first video of Dad I've seen of him alive. And then I'm sitting here thinking, God, I got to come talk about grief today, you know? And it's just there, right? Now, that's not bad or good. It is the way it is. Sky is blue, grass is green. That's how we're made, okay? But I got to be mindful of that, right? And that's all I'm saying. The other thing is remember to self-soothe as you go through this. There is only one way that we are born and created to automatically know how to soothe our amygdala, to know how to soothe our stress response. Do you know how that is? So you can't walk in and say, "Hi, I'm Officer Tim Glover. I'm here to talk to you a minute bit. Hold on just a second." You just can't do that. But it also shows why smoking and eating and drinking are powerful forms of stress management, isn't it? That's because the gastrointestinal tract has a direct nerve line to the amygdala, right? So when I tell folks is your breath is your best self-soothing tool you have, it's with you wherever you go, okay? You know, when you ever hit your thumb with a hammer, what do? You kind of put it in your mouth and you start snickerfrism, ragarism, right? And you start doing this. Well, think of your breath as your first aid response tool. And sometimes you can help somebody else just kind of soothe and calm down, but just as you sit with them and they're quiet, just sit there and just Just take a deep breath with them. Or tell them, hold on just a second. Just take a deep breath for a minute. Right? Be a powerful self-soothing tool. We've used this in relaxation and pain management for decades. It's a powerful tool. So use your breath. Have your own things you use to self-soothe. My badge at work that I wear, or behind my badge, if I flip my badge over, I got a picture of my family. I use that sometimes. I just take a look at it. May carry something in your pocket that, a coin or something you were given of significance that just reminds you of something that's important. Okay? You need to have things that you do to take care of yourself. We'll talk about the science of that later. Try to introduce yourself, your title, and your role. And you may have to do that several times. You may need to have your business cards, of course, that are there that you provide not only to the person you're interviewing, but maybe leave a couple where they'll find them. Maybe ask them, let's put one up here on the refrigerator. Let's put one here by your telephone. Something like that. You want to introduce yourself, your name and your title. They won't remember it the first time. Why? Because this isn't turned on. So there's no pathways into short-term, long-term memory yet. Okay, so you may have to use that sometimes as you do that. Handing them that card gives them a tactile way to develop memory, right? And so you want to use some of those things to do that to help them, or having them write down. Sometimes if you go into a scene, you may want to have a pad and pencil, pen with you that you give to people you're interviewing with so that they can write down things too, maybe your name and things of that nature to help with their memory. Of course, you want to use a calm voice. You want to have a relaxed body posture. I don't necessarily mean one that maybe is not professional or things of that nature, but I'm saying, remembering that stress response, even in your physical, nonverbal communications, you want to be relaxed. That helps them relax. And so what I tell folks is really focus on two areas of your body. First, your shoulders. Relax them. In fact, check your shoulders now. How high are they? Right? Relax your shoulders. The next thing I encourage folks to do is unstick your tongue from the top of your mouth. How many of you, right? Now, I'll say something. Pardon me, Dr. Edwards. I'll go ahead and ask for your forgiveness now. Remember that the same cranial nerves that control your facial muscles control your sphincter muscles. So if you're sitting in an investigation like this right here, and you're all puckered up, I know where else you're puckering, right? I told my 14-year-old son read this one day, talking to him about how to relax when you're on the mound pitching and like this. And so I drove home from work one day. It had been a hard day. I drove up and he's out shooting basketball. I got out of the car and he said, "Hey, Dad." And I said, "Hey, son." He said, "Dad." I said, "What?" He said, "You're wearing your butt on your face." So don't go wearing your butt on your face, okay? So relax body posture, okay? Also, you want to pay attention to some environmental clues that when you're in there, again, stuff that you probably already know. You maybe want to notice pictures, symbols, and objects. Those can help with your investigation. Here's a picture of, tell me about who else is in this picture. Where was this picture taken? Oh, is this where their room is? Well, they're holding this teddy bear. Is that teddy bear? You can use these objects to give you insights into the people that you're working with. Are they very religious? Are there religious objects that are there, or signs of religiosity that can be of help to you as you try to understand them and help them draw upon their own sources of coping? And you want to be aware, again, of the grief response and where they're going through. That they are in a place of shock and denial, so their ability to draw quickly upon memory, to draw quickly upon a sequencing of events which testifies to cognitive associative processes, it's just going to be real sticky. It's going to be really hard for them to shift gears. So you're going to have to be patient with that. And again, you also need to be mindful of cultural differences related to grief, related to loss, related to who communicates with authority and who doesn't. Who's the matriarch or who's the patriarch. You just have to be respectful of different cultural differences. Certain cultures don't look people necessarily in the eyes, particularly people in authority. And so you have to sometimes understand things through certain prisms of various cultures that you work with. So I encourage you that if there's an ethnicity or a cultural group that you find yourself engaging with more and more and more, research that culture and understand more so that you can separate cultural responses from typical responses, you may think, well, they're not making a lot of eye contact with me. What's that about? So just kind of look at that. Does that kind of get that? Any other tips that y'all have found entering into the room? Y'all doing okay? All right. Let me kind of keep moving here. Communication tips. We're going to look at listening, focusing very much on nonverbal. Probably the most important thing to focus on is nonverbal forms of communication. Again, in trauma, language and speech becomes diminished, so you have to begin focusing on nonverbal. And again, what I encourage folks when we talk about listening is use this idea of you're tracking somebody. When Reed was real little, and one of the first snows, we were walking out in the yard like this, and I turned around, and he was trying to put his feet in my footsteps. He was kind of tracking me. And so that's what you want to do. When you're listening to someone and asking questions, you're tracking them along, okay? You're trying to follow where they're at and where they're going and thinking of that nature. And again, I want to mirror their energy level with them. We'll talk about that. As you're listening, then you want to gradually draw out things with them. And we're going to talk about how you ask questions in order to demonstrate concern and understanding. And again, not too many questions. You don't want to rapid fire questions because, again, they can't process that quick because of what trauma is doing. And then how to give some feedback, how to summarize what you're hearing to check out for accuracy and for clarity and for understanding. So let me kind of break some of this down. And again, with that, and try to draw upon some other information. So try to have good eye contact with those that you're engaging with. Doesn't mean that you don't notice others in the room, but you need to know where your focus is. So again, sit or get near that individual in such a way that you can maintain good eye contact. You need to avoid two kind of ways of eye contact. You don't want the serial killer eye contact, because again, facial features can trigger the amygdala like that. We're used to picking that up on individuals. So I don't want to just stare at someone. At the same time, I don't want my eyes darting all around the room either, because that signals kind of stress response as well. Their eyes may be doing that because their brain waves are in alpha waves, and it makes them scan the environment very quickly. Or it could be really shifting into another aspect of alpha waves, which makes their eye gaze almost catatonic and focused somewhere. So you just want a gentle, soft eyes, kind face is the way I often like to speak about that. You want to, again, fit your posture with the other person, be opened and relaxed. You don't want to be like this right here, as you're interviewing with them. If you're writing on something, you may want to have that right there. Again, shoulders relaxed, face relaxed with that. You want to face the individual, but in an indirect way. Okay? So if I'm sitting down, I want to sit at an angle to the individual so that I can see them, but they have other things to look at than just me. I don't want to square up on them, right? I don't want to square my shoulders up on, square up on them face to face. I want to sit at an angle so they can look around and we can still make eye contact. Even in my physical posture, I don't want to do that. Many of you all in law enforcement are probably trained already to kind of stand with firearm away from them, right? Gives you a smaller profile, and that's fine because you're already used to that, protection response for yourself. And that's a fine posture to have with someone as you're just talking with them at an angle there, giving them some other things to look at. And again, you want to keep your own physical movement to a minimum. You don't want to jerk around or keep playing with your hair or you want to be calm and have a presence of calmness and collectedness. Again, notice the nonverbal in yourself and others. Observe what is not said and observe how things are said. Sometimes what I tell folks is if a person's using the same word repetitively over and over, you may want to use that word, So if they talk about, this is just awful. Oh, it's so awful. You may want to just say, this is really awful. That lets them know you're hearing them. You're tracking with them a little bit. Some more communication skills with this. Again, you're tracking when listening. You want to look at keywords or phrases. Focus on some of the feeling words. Focus on what they're kind of making of that as well. Can be really, really important too. How are they interpreting this event that's happened to them? And what conclusions are they drawing? Life will never be the same. I just want to die myself. These kind of phrases sometimes are that's where their interpretations are going. You just want to focus on that. You want to mirror their own pace and tone and energy. So you want to slow maybe your own speech down a little bit. If they're talking real quick, you can help them slow down by you talking slower and asking them to take a deep breath. Again, listening is your most important investigative technique. It's also your most important supportive technique as you talk with them there. Some of the drawing out responses, some just phrases you may want to kind of keep with you, is you can just say, tell me more about that. So you walked in and noticed the baby wasn't breathing. Tell me more about that. Or you can use another phrase, then what happened next? So you just open-ended. You're just kind of giving them a question to help them unfold this story little by little by little by little by little. You know, it's like a child walking around with a knife in their hand. If you went up to try to grab that knife, what would they? They just hold tighter and jerk, right? It's the same way with this very painful experience. You got to coax the grip to loosen, right? And so using some of these questions of, tell me more about that. What happened next? You have some strong feelings about that. Tell me more about why you feel that way. You seem to have a very strong opinion about that or thought. Tell me more about why you think that way. You know, not yes or no, but why, how. Share more of that. Or sometimes you can circle back to a piece of data in the story that you feel you need to come back to. You want to drill down a little deeper there. You can come back and say, you know, you were mentioning kind of when you got in from work, I'd like to hear more about kind of, you know, as you first kind of came in the door. You know, you can ask folks to circle back. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about what was said. Tell me more about what you saw. Tell me more about what you smelled. Those kind of things can open up people. And again, sometimes as you talk with someone, you can see that stress response kick back in, and so their narrative begins to wind down a little bit. And what you can say to them, you know, they just seem to just come to, right? You can say, you can pick up back the maybe two, you know, you were saying that you just walked into the room. Or you were saying you just picked up your baby. You kind of repeat the last two words they said so they can kind of jumpstart the conversation again, jumpstart the story again. Again, don't interrupt. You may have to be comfortable with long pauses, right? Because this isn't turned on. And so it may take a while for their thoughts and their language and their experience and their memory to sink a little bit. So be careful with that. And again, you want to use some value-neutral words to diffuse. Instead of saying, you know, you may want to use crying instead of the word hysterical. You know, you may want to say, let me suggest to you versus you should or you ought. So sometimes using some value-neutral words can help, again, keep them safe with you. If they feel safe with you, then they're going to be more and more likely to open up and share what's going on with you. Again, you want to use feedback to summarize, break the information down into pieces or steps. Deal with one thing at a time. Again, they can't multitask. Our brains are not equipped to multitask anyway, but particularly when the brain is in trauma, it can't multitask. And so you have to break down pieces of information. If there's things that you need him to do, you may want to have instructions at step at a time, right? You don't want to just put a lot of things there and let them process. And again, sometimes you may want to write down key information or provide a handout with them that they can use to refer back to that time. And again, paraphrase. Let me make sure I understood you. Let me make sure I got everything here correctly. And then paraphrase back what they've shared with you. Again, just some good communication tips. And then recovery rituals. The science shows that you really have to have things in your life to recover your energy, right? So I'm going to spend energy, I'm going to recover energy. And it's a training technique right now used with athletes, with elite forces, and everything else. There's a real science behind it. But what I want to leave you with to talk about is that you need to make sure that you have things in your day and things in your week in which you are replenishing the energy that stress depletes because of your work. Those can be something as complex as or you have to really do some planning for, like hunting and fishing, or a hobby, or a craft, or exercise, or a walk, or something as simple as just listening to some music, having a good sip of coffee, or just kind of noticing a flower. Whatever that is, you have to have something from big to little to manage that recovery ritual. So a take-home phrase for this is recovery ritual. And then my hope is that many of you have various critical incident stress management teams that can come in and help you debrief a traumatic experience for your team. We use them at the hospital. We have about 4 teams that we use when we have a department that's had a traumatic event that happened. Or when they've just kind of been in they've just had it. They've had one loss after another, one employee, colleague, something. We just come in with a CISM team and debrief that with them. So my hope is that you'll never undervalue your life. The work you do is sacred, and so you deserve that self-care, the kind of care that you give to everybody else. You deserve to give some of that to yourself. So let me stop there, Dr. Edwards, and let's turn it back over to you. Unless y'all coming up on a break, so I'm standing between you all and the bathroom and everything else, so I don't want to do that. What I will say is I'll be glad just to kind of hang around. So if you have questions or other things, I'll be glad to talk with you about that. But again, God bless you. Thank you for what you do every day. Keep safe, and have a good rest of the day. Dr. Edwards.